Bookstart Brad for the last 40 years, and today I have my special guest. He is the author of the book Unequal Justice, no other than Mr. James M. Porfido. Welcome to Book 101, Mr. James, and can you please introduce more about yourself?
Absolutely, Daniel. Thank you for having me on. And I can talk a little bit about myself in the book. I'm an attorney. For 35 years, I've been an attorney. I'm a former prosecutor and head of sex crimes and child abuse and vehicular homicide in the Morris County Prosecutor's Office in New Jersey. I'm a certified criminal trial attorney, certified by the Supreme Court of New Jersey since 1995. I had a very active criminal defense practice for more than 20 years. I'm a TV legal analyst. I've covered a number of high profile cases over the years on various forms of media. I'm also a law professor at Seton Hall University Law School, excuse me, in Newark, New Jersey. And I teach a class, Advocacy and Persuasion. And the book is really about my journey through law over 35 years. All of the cases, not all, but most of the cases that were high profile as a prosecutor and defense attorney that I wanted to share those stories and those experiences. And also I dispelled the constitutional ideas that we have that you're innocent until proven guilty. And I dispel that notion really by taking my experience from one side of the courtroom to the other side of the courtroom. Going from the prosecution to the defense was really quite an eye-opener. And of course, I also represented crime victims throughout the years. And I talk about that in the book as well. So I talk about those experiences throughout my journey through law.
Mr. James Porfido, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge to the world. So, how would you define an equal justice in the legal system?
Well, from my experience, I talk about, as a young prosecutor and the cases that I handled, and I include them in the book and I talk about them by chapter. I give them references like, for instance, the babysitters from hell, the Halloween mask, the killing of M and the death by prison, the living, breathing, walking homicide victim. And then I talk about how I take on the defense world and how ultimately I ended up doing defense work. What was the case that changed everything really from my prosecution perspective? And it really was a particular case that led me to leave the prosecutor's office and become a defense counsel. And it was a case I had prosecuted, involved the death of a mom. She was killed by a drunk driver who was driving recklessly. And I became involved in the case and got to know her husband very well. And the laws in New Jersey that existed back in 1994 were if you drove drunk and killed someone, a fatality, you could face a maximum under the traditional death by auto laws of 270 days of county jail or 270 days of community service in the discretion of the court based upon a weighing of what we call aggravating and mitigating circumstances. And certainly if you had no prior criminal history, the likelihood is you could get a maximum of 270 days in county jail. So when I explained that to her husband, he was appalled to hear that, as you can imagine. His wife was tragically killed and gone. And it didn't matter to him what the instrumentality was of the killing, whether it was a gun or a knife or a vehicle driven by a drunk driver. It was the same outcome, the same result. And he single-handedly changed the laws in the state of New Jersey. And on what would have been Terry's 40th birthday, Terry's laws were enacted and signed into law by then Governor Whitman. And the laws now carry a mandatory state prison sentence of 3 years mandatory minimum. So if you are convicted or you plead guilty, you must face that time. And you will be sentenced to that as a minimum of 3 years. Well, the case got a little bit more, well, I got to know her after the case was, I got to know him after the case was over. And certainly I got to know her through him sharing the stories and experiences. Well, he was jogging by the site where his wife was killed, and he was tragically hit by a car and killed himself. And he had started a foundation to educate high school students about the dangers of drinking and driving and drug and alcohol awareness, and speaking about the case. And it was really a landmark type of case in our particular venue in Morris County, because the driver was ultimately convicted for an aggravated manslaughter. And just to give the listeners an idea, it's really the equivalent of a homicide without a purposeful knowing intent. It's done recklessly with a conscious disregard to the value of human life. So that was the legal standard upon which he was convicted, and the jury of 12 people unanimously ruled or determined the verdict that he was guilty, and he was sentenced to 20 years in state prison, 10 years without parole. And as I said, the husband started this foundation after changing the law, so he was a very dynamic man. And I got to know him, and when he was tragically killed himself, he was hit by a driver that fell asleep. And I took his place on the board doing the speaking, and I spoke to about 75,000 to 77,000 high school students over a period of 2 years, sharing the experience about the case and about the law, and trying to educate them about that, and making them aware of how dangerous it is to be a driver or passenger in those situations. So that was the one case that kind of changed things. I became a defense attorney, and as a defense attorney, it kind of opened my eyes to how the system really was pro-prosecution or pro-state. I felt that the judges and the prosecutors were working together to ensure that, you know, the accused, many cases, my clients, the alleged crimes that were committed, were guilty, you know, to help the prosecution in the case. In many different ways, and I can certainly explain that, but I felt that very strongly, that the system wasn't the same system. You know, the same system that I operated under as a prosecutor was not the same system as the defense attorney.
So, Mr. James, in what ways does economic status affect access to fair representation?
Well, that's a great question, you know, because as a private defense attorney, you're paid by your client. They give you a retainer, and the way most defense attorneys work is that we do it in stages of proceedings. In other words, they'll give you an initial retainer, and if the case can be resolved within that time frame, within that money that's paid, the case gets resolved. Otherwise, there's like scales, like there's stages of proceedings. You get to pretrial stages, and ultimately you get to a trial proceeding. And as each stage goes up, the fees go up. And so what happens is that if the case takes long enough, and it can be delayed, and that was a common tactic that I found, that prosecutors would delay the case. They would stall the case, and you would be in court unnecessarily. And you would have many appearances before the court. And by the time the case was ready to go forward, there was no more money. The clients just did not have the money to fund litigation to get their day in court. And ultimately, you would have to be, as the counsel, not being paid. You'd have to file a motion or an application to the court to be relieved of counsel, to be relieved of services. And that happened all too often, unfortunately. I found it especially towards the latter part of my career doing defense work.
Thank you for your empowering answer, Mr. James. Thank you so much. So, why do sentencing outcomes vary so widely for similar crimes?
Well, you know, in most states, New Jersey in particular, because I can speak from my experience in New Jersey, we grade offenses by degrees. Now, in New Jersey, the lowest level of an offense is a fourth degree. It carries 18 months of incarceration. And then you go to a third degree, and it carries 3 to 5 years. And then you go to a second degree, and it carries a maximum sentence of 10 years. And then first degree is 20 to 30 years to life, depending upon, you know, the particular crime. So it's really based upon the crime that's committed. And some crimes do carry with them presumptions of imprisonment. Anything in the second degree range that I just discussed, or higher, second or first degree, carries a mandatory presumption of imprisonment, which is the likelihood you most definitely will be going to state prison. Now, the court has to weigh out sentencing, and they do that in each case. and they have to look at the aggravating and the mitigating circumstances in order to determine the appropriate sentence. So that's why it varies case to case, crime to crime, and certainly individual to individual, it can vary. So there's a lot of variables in play for sure that change the sentencing. So it's not a hard and fast sentence for each particular crime. It's really ultimately up to the discretion of the court or the judge in the sentencing.
So, Mr. James, did you talk about this in your book?
I do, absolutely. I talk about the discretion of the court, and sometimes, there's too much discretion, in my opinion, that the court sentences people for exercising their right to go to trial and imposing a maximum sentence, which is not always justice. It's not fair, certainly, and it may not be appropriate, quite frankly. Just because someone exercises their constitutional right to go to trial does not mean that they should be subject to more punishment.
So, Mr. James, what are the consequences of unequal justice for communities over time?
Well, I look at it from my experience. Do I talk about it in terms of race or minorities and how, if it's disproportionately affecting them? I don't really get into that subject, but from my experience and from my certainly my knowledge and my opinion in reading things, I feel that that is prevalent in our system. That certain communities are treated differently, and that there is a perception of that. If you're wealthy, you can get away with things. Look at the O.J. Simpson case. With he literally, obviously the jury disagreed, but he got away with a murder, two murders, quite frankly. Ron Goldman and Nicole Brown Simpson were killed, and the evidence in that case was almost overwhelming that he was guilty of the offenses that he was charged with, but the jury concluded otherwise. And he had a dream team in place of many lawyers that he paid a lot of money for. So, yeah, maybe there is a price to justice. And certainly in that case, that is a perfect example of that.
So, Mr. James, what reforms would help reduce unequal justice in criminal law?
That's a great question, Daniel. Really, it's a bit systemic. I mean, we really have had a problem in our system of justice, the criminal justice system, for quite some time. Really, it's been going on for a very, very, very long time. And the difficulty is, I don't know that you can take people's prejudices out of the system. In other words, a judge or a prosecutor or even defense attorney may have their own view of things, and it's very difficult. When we select a jury in a criminal case, the judge will instruct them that they are not to be influenced by outside influences. It's simply what happens in the courtroom in terms of the evidence that's introduced and the testimony of witnesses, and they're basically a blank slate. In other words, you have to erase everything else from your life to hear this case and make a determination or a verdict as to the outcome of the case, whether someone's guilty or not guilty of a crime. And that's very difficult, if not impossible, to do. And I see that happen, and I certainly saw it in my experience where judges were predisposed to feel that your client was guilty, especially if they're charged with a very horrible crime. The judges don't want that person on the street. They're covering themselves, and they want to make sure. And I understand this idea, this mentality, that they don't want this person out on the street because they feel like, hey, if they commit another offense, that's on them. They're responsible. So they feel that their job is really to keep this person locked up or incarcerated unless and until. And that until is they have their day in court, and ultimately the case is litigated or tried, or the individual pleads guilty based upon a review of the evidence to determine whether the evidence is, number one, admissible and is persuasive or powerful enough to sustain the state's burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt.
So, Mr. James, are there specific laws or policy you believe contribute to systemic inequality?
Well, it's difficult to speak to that
Yes.
issue directly.
Yes.
It's, it's because the legislatures legislate. You know, we have a system of government, you know, in the United States where checks and balances are in place. We have the legislative branch, we have the judiciary branch, and we have the executive branch. And it's difficult to speak to the laws that get passed, how they're implemented, and ultimately how they're interpreted. That's a big issue in cases. You know, for instance, I could just talk about like gun laws in New Jersey, because there are mandatory sentencing in gun laws where you will face state prison, and it is mandatory for simply carrying a gun without a permit or having a gun within your possession without a permit. Now, the enactment of that law, the legislative intent behind the enactment of that law was to prevent gun violence in gangs. Gangs were using guns and committing crimes, and it was a huge issue that had to be addressed. So this law was passed, but the law now applies to everyone and anyone. It's not really just applied simply to gangs. So, you know, when you ask that question, it really depends, looking at the specific law. If someone is treated disparagingly or disparately different than someone else, like drug laws are a big example of that. You know, we see, and certainly back in the day, now most states are legalizing marijuana now, but people were being prosecuted for marijuana type offenses, and I certainly handled a number of those cases as a defense attorney. And those laws, quite frankly, don't exist today, or they've been modified considerably. So yeah, you would see people in certain populations committing those types of offenses versus another offense. Yeah, I mean that became obvious to me at some point for sure.
So, Mr. James, what would be your advice for those people out there suffering from an equal justice?
Well, you know, you have to exercise your constitutional rights, and the Fifth Amendment of our Constitution really is protection against making full self-incrimination. In other words, if you're questioned by the police, you have a right to assert your right to counsel. Now, it has to be a custodial type of setting. If you're brought in for questioning about an offense, you have the right to assert counsel. The Sixth Amendment to our Constitution is a very important amendment to our Constitution because it provides that you have a right to counsel, and it has a right, you have a right to confront the witnesses against you. In other words, you have a right to cross-examine those witnesses. What the law does not say is competent, capable counsel. That's my advice, is people really need to make sure that they're represented by someone that knows the law, knows the system, perhaps knows that particular court, and knows the judges in that system and how they operate. How did they work in the past? What's their history? What's their background? Particular prosecutors, have you dealt with them? You know, what is going to be their position on a particular case? And I think having that knowledge and that background and that experience helps the client or the accused tremendously. Because look, having an attorney is one thing, but having a very competent, capable, qualified attorney that is passionately and aggressively and zealously representing you, that's something quite different.
Totally agree, Mr. James, and thank you so much for your advice. So, what will be your short term and long term goals as a writer as well as a
Well,
lawyer?
yeah, well, I still practice. I'm actually of counsel with the firm. I closed my practice in 2023, and I became affiliated to a firm, connected to a firm. The name of the firm is Einhorn Barbarito, Frost Botwinick, Nunn and Musmano. That's a long name. And we're in New Jersey, and I'm of counsel in the criminal section. Um, but I'm not actively taking on the cases that I used to take on. So I'm looking at this writing of the book and these experiences of talking about the book and the people and the lives that were affected. Quite frankly, that's what the book is about. It really is about those people that were involved in those cases in their lives that were affected. Although I don't name them by name, the stories are resonating with people that know about those cases or had experiences with those cases. And, you know, I think it's to shed a light on the fact that perhaps we can do better. We can do better as a system. Judges can be better. Prosecutors' job is to do justice. I look at the role of the court as this, and really, it's kind of a frame of reference for any judge is to be neutral, unbiased, detached from the case, not to have an interest in the outcome of the case, and not to have a predisposition in the case, because that obviously does affect your judgment and your ability to preside over a case. And so often, frequently, we've seen that judges that should have recused themselves from cases continue to stay on. And it just gives, there's an obvious conflict of interest if that judge remains on the case. And what that does is it really doesn't speak well about the system itself. When those judges remain on that case, they really cast a shadow over the entirety of the system when they do that. And they need to be smarter about that. You know, if you're presiding over a case and you know you have a conflict of interest and it's been revealed and you've been told that you have that conflict, the better course of action is just to say, you know what, let's transfer this case to another judge. That way that we can avoid this appearances of improprieties. We don't need to do that. You know, and the job of the prosecutor is quite simple. Do justice. Do justice. It doesn't mean ensure convictions. It doesn't mean that everyone's guilty. Every case file that you open that the individual is guilty of the offense. You have to review what the evidence is and determine that that individual truly did commit the offense, number one. And number two, that the evidence is there to support the charge.
Good luck to your goals, Mr. James, and looking forward for more and more empowering books like this to come. So, before we wrap up our discussion for today, I'm inviting you to please do listen to my other podcast, Law 101. In each first season, first season with Mr. Andy Samachuk. Please do listen to our latest episode. We are talking about Mr. Donald Trump Global Visa. So, please do listen, Law 101, wherever you listen your podcast. So, Mr. James, do you believe true legal equality is achievable? And if so, how?
Legal qualities,
Yes, equality.
legal equality. I think there's an opportunity for all of us, you know, and you know, the difficulty is, Daniel, quite frankly, is people's exposure to the criminal justice system is very limited. And that's a good thing, you know, honestly. You don't really know how you're going to be affected or how the system is not working unless you're involved in that process. Most people's encounters are with the police officer or at the roadside if it's a traffic stop or something like that. That's not something, you know, the cases that I handled were those cases as well as much more serious, significant crimes. And in those particular circumstances, you know, there is the ability to be treated differently. And quite frankly, the system does treat those people differently, especially when they're accused of serious crime. From my experience, I'm talking about, and my feeling was that the scales were tipped unfairly in favor of the prosecution. And as the book cover shows, Lady Justice is peeking out from the blindfold, which means that she's looking at the scales of justice and, quite frankly, measuring the scales of justice and putting her finger on the scale and weighing the scale one side, giving them an unfair advantage over the other. And that's how I viewed it later on in my career, having handled a number of high profile criminal defense cases where I felt that my clients were guilty just walking into the courtroom.
Mr. James M. Porfido, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge to the world. So, can you please invite our listeners to support unequal justice? Mr.
Well,
James?
the book is available, Daniel, on Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com, and certainly they can find me by Googling my name. It's very easy. Just simply Google James M. Porfido, attorney, and they'll find me. Or there's a website dedicated to the book, www.unequal-justice.com.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. James and Porfido, because if you support him, more empowering justice to come. So, Mr. James, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I appreciate it. Thank you for the opportunity.
More to come, people. See you soon.